Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Let us bow for a word of prayer. All wise and eternal God, we thank you for the opportunity to come together to hear the voices that you've assigned for tonight. We thank you for our panelists. We thank you, God, for what you've already deposited into them. And we're reminded of your word in Isaiah in the 58th chapter that says that we are to be the repairers of the breach. There are many breaches that we must look at, God. And so we ask for wisdom, guidance, and insight as we unpack all of what you would have us see tonight, tomorrow, and on Sunday. We ask that you would bless our time together and allow us to hear your word come through your speakers. This is our prayer in the name of Jesus. We ask it. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Lisa.
Amen.
And we also do want to acknowledge that we're on Powhatan land, and we recognize the history there. So I'll begin by introducing Dr. Cleve Tinsley and turn it over to him. So Dr. Cleve Tinsley is an assistant professor of history, religion, and Africana studies at Virginia Union University, where he has also been appointed as the inaugural director of the Center for African American History and Culture. He is also a non-resident research fellow with the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University. Dr. Tinsley earned his master's and PhD in religion from Rice, where he concentrated in the study of African American religions. He is a scholar of race, religion, Black freedom movements, and Black American identity. Welcome, Dr. Tinsley. Take it away. You're muted, yeah. You're yeah.
Let me try again. Greetings, everyone. Good night to you. It's an honor to be with you at Richmond Hill and all of our constituent partnerships. It's a great to be here with you tonight to have this important conversation around reparations. And so we're grateful to be here tonight on the first of 3 events during this weekend. I'd like to just start with some framing remarks and then turn over to some panelists that we've invited on tonight. We're here because of Reparations Sunday RVA, one of 3 events, but reparations is an important conversation to have, or at least we've started having now. Since at least the summer of 2019, George Floyd, everyone remembers it. And in the wake of what many have referred to as a new moment and energy around racial reckoning and Black justice struggle, many communities now have been emboldened to spark new conversations about the legacy and afterlife of Black enslavement and the need for reparations. Now, we employ this term reparation is not only an acknowledgement of past harms, but a recognition of the need to bolster Black social life, given the catastrophes of the Black Atlantic slave trade, but also the colonial impulses that drove it and continue to shape the forms of enslavement today if we consider issues of redlining of the criminal legal system and issues of gentrification. But the question tonight we pose, and that we'll answer in part, at least we get to discuss, is what does reparations entail? Materially speaking, how can one quantify the great physical, psychic, moral, and social toil that Black enslavement has on the lives of African Americans today? And with respect to the interior lives, not just of Black folks, but of all folks, what are the moral consequences of slavery in its afterlife? What must this nation bear up under, ethically speaking? And what must our communities still suffer from, and what needs to be redressed? Well, tonight we're here to begin this conversation in partnership with all the organizations mentioned before. All of these partners are at the forefront of national conversations about reparations and local movements. They're both about dialogue and actions. And each of those we've asked to come and present have distinct approaches to reparations based on different interests, different expertise, and experiences from across the country. And we're excited to have them. Now, because we have so many great folks today, what we've decided to do is allow them to say a brief word about themselves before they have their opening remarks. And so what I'm going to do now is ask a prompt, an initial prompt, and ask our panelists to each introduce themselves, but then also give us remarks around a simple question, something like this. So as we mentioned, part of what intrigues us about today's conversation is the unique perspectives that each of you has in your own research and experiences that you bring. So tonight we want to start with this question. Can you offer to us each just a statement on what reparations entails and means for you? In other words, what are its material, moral, and constituent elements as you see them? And what is it about reparations conversations and strategies that you think are lacking? What do you think is the gap that you've been called to kind of fill in this conversation? As we have no distinct order, so if you permit me, I'm going to ask Delegate McQuinn if she would start us off answering this question. What is reparations to you? What do you see missing, and how is your work so important to this, if you don't mind starting us?
Good afternoon, and thank you again for thank you for the opportunity to be with this esteemed panel of individuals who've been studying and walking in this and understanding it. And thank you for all that you all do to help address this particular issue. My name is Dolores Mcqueen. I am in the House of Delegates and for the state of Virginia, and have been there now since 2009. But prior to that, I served as a city council member as well as a school board representative for the city of Richmond. And I'm also a minister, associate minister at New Bridge Baptist Church. And, just the issue of reparation, what is it? What does it mean? And I've had an opportunity actually over the years to do some extensive work in this area and help to lead government as well as work in collaboration with Governor Northam to help address these issues in a multifaceted way. Reparations, when I look at this, what I have looked as serving as a member of an organization that also addressed the issue of slavery that was hidden for 150 years in the city of Richmond. And I grew up here and knew nothing about it. I've looked at this and said, how do we begin to identify and help to address and share with others the injury, the harm, the violations against African Americans because of the color of their skin. And we all know that it started from the moment of slavery and that was recorded in 1619, that it began to build systems where there was a systems of superiority and a system of inferiority. That system, the one of inferiority, continues to permeate in the atmosphere. We see it in the criminal justice system. It is in housing. We see it in education. There are communities actually in which I've served for 25 years where poverty is poverty stricken and people are still struggling, trying to come to a realization that, listen, I need, I want, and I should have. And they have been many ways subjugated in these particular communities for every sense that I could remember. And so when we look at the issue of reparation, first of all, we look at the issue of harm, the injury, the disenfranchisement, and then asking that those systems that have violated us to begin to, first of all, acknowledge that there's been harm done and that the people who have been harmed how do you repair the harm that's been done? How do you help address it? And I think that as we look at this harm that runs through the pigmentation of our skin and through our DNA in many ways, how do we address it? How do we help others to acknowledge, first of all, there was a moral harm, psychological, you name it, the harm that has been done. Acknowledge it, and then we can move to a place where we can begin to figure out what does it mean, what does it look like in terms of trying to repair the damage that's been done.
Thanks so much, Delegate McQuinn. We appreciate it. We're going to ask before I go to our next panelist that everyone, can you please mute your mics as our speakers are presenting? We don't want to interrupt them as they're speaking. Next, I'm going to ask if Dr. Ivor Carruthers, if you don't mind offering your perspective, what is the meaning of reparation? How has your work intersected with it over the years?
Good evening, and thank you so much for having me. I am coming to you this evening from Chicago, Illinois. I serve as the General Secretary of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. We are an interdenominational network of clergy leaders, congregations. We reach out and dig deeply in partnership with philanthropic community, those in labor, and those organizations that stay on the wall and the ground for justice for those most marginalized. I also am very blessed to be the founding executive director of the Center for Reparatory Justice, Transformation, and Remediation. And that center is housed in McCormick Theological Seminary. And I think that is significant at this moment in terms of racial reckoning, in which a major seminary within the United States has had the audacity and courage to say that they want to partner to right the wrongs and to help to facilitate our forward movement towards justice. And that is really how I come to do this work, my commitment to do this work, this ministry, grounded in both personal experience and the ways in which I have been afforded the privileges and blessings of education and opportunity to travel, et cetera. So at a very personally deep kind of understanding of what it means for this work. I had a great uncle who fled the United States, went to Brazil, now have 6 generations of family in Brazil as a result of the massacre in Elaine, Arkansas, in which Blacks were killed in a church as they were planning to figure out how to organize their labor and the fruit of their work. Murdered, massacre, it drove really to a large extent, that kind of violence during the period of 1919 drove what many misread to be the Great Migration, about a quest for jobs. And so at a very deeply personal level, I grew up with a narrative of what racism would do. I also lived through, as a child, the implications and the consequences of seeing Emmett Till's body in a casket and understanding what happened to him. But I also grew up with a deep faith, grown in the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, in which I was always able to feel the divinity within me. I saw a Jesus in my father, in my girlfriend's father, when we did the various pageants. I saw and heard what it meant to understand the text of liberation from Luke and my quest for that. So in understanding what Deuteronomy teaches us, that we must always tell the story to the generations yet to come, generation after generation, how God has been with us, that has been the call to reparations for me. And so as I have been afforded opportunity to do things like share in congregations and ministries, to go to the United Nations and speak before them about these issues as a part of the Decade for People of African Descent, to be able to share with others around the world in terms of their shared experiences of marginalization and the call and demand for reparations. I am able to lift up in our Christian context, Zacchaeus as a model for what this means and how this works. And what it means and how this works in our context is that there is not enough money that anybody could ever print or make to compensate us for what we have experienced. And so I call upon the power of those ancestors, those who are dressed in white, and they ask the question, who are they? Those that survived the Great Tribulation, those that are who are at the bottom of the ocean. I call upon their power, their ancestral power, to join us in this room as we have this conversation. But Zacchaeus got it right. Zacchaeus understood that it was about money, but he first had to atone. He had to make amends. He had to bow down. And that's what this process means. It means acknowledging the harm that is done. It means identifying the ways that you can atone for that harm in terms of your individual and institutional collective complicity. And it means to make amends however you can. And that includes, but it is not sufficient in and of itself. It includes repairing through the payments. And Zacchaeus made it really clear because he paid 4 times over, right? And so we know that there is a process, there is a biblical basis around which we're claiming this conversation. We're claiming it with the full authority that, first of all, we understand our obligation to create spaces for sacred memory. We understand that we cannot forget the pain and the travail of those who have gone before that allow us the comfortability to even have this conversation. And we understand that we will not rest until justice comes. So that's how I see my quest for reparations and the demand as I work diligently and prayerfully in concert with each and every one of these panelists who I share this space with tonight.
Thanks so much, Dr. Carruthers, for your remarks. Next, we're going to ask Reverend Lindsey Franklin, who has a different perspective and enters a different way, to provide some comments for us as well. Reverend Franklin.
Good evening, everyone. So I'm Reverend Lindsey Franklin, and I serve as Associate Pastor for Development here at Richmond Hill. But I'm here tonight primarily to talk more about personal work that I've been doing, which is taking a deep dive into my own family history, a history that runs deep in Virginia and includes a whole lot of white Christian clergy and a whole lot of enslavers. Reparations for me begins first with looking honestly at this history, trying to see myself and my history fully. To be clear, this in and of itself is not adequate, and I know that, but I have to begin here. My ancestors were there both at Jamestown and at Plymouth, so colonization is baked into my DNA. I am a WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, through and through. My Jamestown ancestor is none other than John Rolfe, whose marriage to Pocahontas, while she was in captivity, not only embodied colonization, but also perpetuated this persistent myth that a history of genocide can be healed by interracial relationship. Another ancestor, Alexander H.H. Stewart of Stanton, Virginia, inherited enslaved people from his mother, Eleanor Briscoe Stewart, in 1858. And by 1860, he enslaved 9 people. He was also a leading voice to end Reconstruction, writing a letter to the Richmond Times-Dispatch on Christmas Day in 1868 that granting the Black vote is begrudgingly acceptable because, in his view, whites will always maintain land, wealth, and power. Kelly Brown Douglas, in her book, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, writes about how white supremacy is built on the twin myths of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism and manifest destiny, myths that see white Christian power and property as God created and God ordained. I can trace these myths through my family history, but I can't begin to untangle them unless I look at their particulars. And for me, looking at their particulars, the particulars of my ancestry, looking at the ledgers, at the wills, lifting up the names of the people, my people enslaved, Rachel, Joe the Miller, Katie, Frederick, reading the brutally banal language that masks the buying and selling and loaning and inheriting and bequeathing of human beings, written in the hands of my people. This work for me as a white Christian is where the work of reparations begins. I'll say here that my goal is not to see my ancestors as monsters. To turn my ancestors into monsters puts too much distance between them and me, between the history and the present. Instead, looking at the brutality in my ancestry turns my attention to the brutality of the present. Mass incarceration, the killing of Black people by white police officers, the vast wealth inequality between white and Black families, white and Black churches, white and Black people. Not only do I need to look at the ledgers of the lives of my ancestors and holding them to account, I also have to look at the ledgers and budgets of my own life, seeing how money and power work through me. Looking with a reparative lens in my own life means looking at my budget, how I spend my resources, and seeing my own giving not as helping or charity, but understanding it through the lens of a debt owed, a reparative call for the transfer of wealth from white to Black communities. I also know that individual acts alone cannot solve systemic problems. I, of course, support HR 40. I sit on the Justice and Witness Committee of the Potomac Association of the United Church of Christ, and we've just begun to think about what a reparations lens could look like in our own budget and justice work. And here at Richmond Hill, we've just begun the conversation of what our role could be, both in doing our own work, understanding the history of enslavement here on our land, and in supporting churches to do this work throughout metropolitan Richmond. And I'm really glad to be part of this conversation with all of these people on this panel. I'll close by saying that I am just at the beginning of this work, and I know it's not enough, and I don't know where it will lead. And I'll also admit that I have some fear about where it will go and where it will lead me. But I also know that God is here in this work of repair. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Reverend Lindsey. I enjoyed all of your remarks. Delegates McQuinn, Dr. Carruthers, and Reverend Lindsey. All of you provided some fresh insights and perspective that I really appreciate. Next, we want to ask Benjamin Mertz, musician and educator, if you will come offer your unique perspective into this and talk about it.
Oh, it is my pleasure and what an honor to be surrounded by so many towering academics and leaders in this community. What a blessing and an honor. I come from a musical tradition. I come from a choir directing tradition and from a music tradition of a people beginning all the way back when folks were singing to one another to follow the drinking gourd. Back when folks were singing to one another to wade in the water. Back when folks were singing, steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. I ain't got long to stay here. And using that music in order to create a consciousness and an understanding. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land and tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. Building through the music a consciousness and an understanding of the humanity and the personhood of Black and brown people living through the catastrophe of American slavery. And yet, as a student and a teacher of the Black spiritual music tradition, what I have the honor to be the steward of is a body of work of songs, Hold On Just a Little While Longer, Keep Your Hand on the Plow, a body of music that was handed down from parent to child to child to child, from generation to generation, human beings who were denied the right to learn how to read, to learn how to write, and yet sang their stories. Nobody knows the trouble I seen. Had the opportunity to sing their stories, teach their stories to their children who would teach it to their children, so that someday the idea of the full humanness and the full humanity of Black and brown people would be recognized by the world. To me, my dear friends, the Black spiritual music tradition is the most powerful and greatest body of work that any group of human beings have created in the last 500 years of our history. Because no creation of a body of work has happened underneath such a tremendous weight of oppression. And so the role that I hope to play, both tonight and just in general, is a reminder of the great resilience and the power and the artistry and the creativity, that the only way to really counteract oppression is to be creative, is to be building something and creating something, and to fix this idea of history around who are the geniuses and who are the creatives. The capital G geniuses are Maya Angelou, are James Baldwin, are Frederick Douglass, are Fannie Lou Hamer. Those are the words, those are the human beings upon whose shoulders we stand. And there could have been, my friends, under this kind of oppression, there could have been Black terrorist organizations generation by generation by generation. And instead we have given the world, all of these amazing musicians, all the amazing poets, all these amazing writers, all these amazing preachers, all these amazing teachers upon whose shoulders that we stand. And so I truly believe that part of the reparations conversation and journey is the acknowledgement of the full humanity and the full creative, broad beauty of Black and brown people on this continent and what we have contributed. Because I believe if we are seen as fully human, I don't think we are there yet. And I think that part of the journey still involves asserting our full and complete humanity on this planet, which we have, God knows, earned by now.
Thanks so much, Benjamin, for your remarks as well. All so profound. There's so much to chew on. I can't wait to ask some further discussions. Next, I want to ask Doctors Medria Connolly and Bryan Nichols. I'm not sure if you're together, but if you are, if you don't mind giving your opening remarks now.
Hi, thanks for having us. We are together. We are together in what we call our Reparations project out here in Los Angeles.
Okay.
Well, we're both clinical psychologists who are, I'd say, rather new to the reparations area. For me personally, I've been a psychologist in practice, but also for many years working in various community programs, and particularly in gang prevention and gang intervention, which in Los Angeles was a very big project that required multiracial collaborations. But time and time again, I saw those multiracial collaborations break down into very typical racialized conflict. And I kept trying to understand why people who came together, professed for a cause to make things better, kept breaking down amongst themselves. It seemed as though there was an invisible force that kept undermining our ability to work together. And with that in mind, and plus witnessing other experiences in conferences where there was an explicit effort to understand the influences of unresolved racial issues of the past, those conferences also broke down into racial conflict. And I kept trying to figure out, what is this force that keeps subverting our effort? On a given Sunday morning, I sat down and I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations. And it answered a kind of a long-standing question. Why, after 50 years after the civil rights movement, do we still have all the problems that we have? And the answer was clear. We have these problems because there was a crime committed against humanity that was never atoned for, never acknowledged. When there is a crime such as that and there's no atonement, it leaves a taint in the air. It leaves a stench. And that is what corrupts all of our efforts. This is a reflection of the unhealed soul of America, as I understand it. So what I thought I would do, and then my partner Medria, she'll talk in a minute about what we're trying to do together, was add sort of an addendum to Ta-Nehisi's case for reparations. We thought we'd try to write the psychological case for reparations, clarifying what we see as the psychological resistances to reparations and the psychological path toward it as well. We see it as a healing. And our emphasis is on healing. You know, there's the economics are necessary for healing, but we're looking at the psychological healing that would come for African Americans, but also the healing that would come for those who identify as white Americans. Because I think that if they don't engage in an act of atonement, if the country doesn't atone and heal, then there will continue to be a need to sustain that myth of superiority and to sustain it with sustained violence against us. I think without atonement, that will continue to happen. And so that has been kind of our focus in reparations. I'll let Medria take it from there.
As Bryan has said, we're new. We're kind of late to the party here, if you will, and thinking about it. And again, Bryan was inspired by Ta-Nehisi Coates' paper, and I was inspired by Bryan, who was so excited about Ta-Nehisi's paper that, you know, we decided, it's like, okay, let's think about this. As we reflected on it, what became clear to us is that you cannot build a country on a crime against humanity, ignore that, and pretend that it doesn't matter. That you know, it's as if we go about saying we can do whatever we want to whomever we want, wherever we want. We don't have to acknowledge when we're wrong, and there are no consequences for our behavior. That breeds a culture of arrogance and fantasies of omnipotence, and that is pretty destructive to everyone not just to African Americans. So one of the things that we noticed when we mentioned the word reparations, just the word, that everyone got uncomfortable, that there is this major discomfort there. And so our question as psychologists, or our observation as psychologists, was there is something that is just below the surface of the American psyche that creates the kind of emotional charge that we have witnessed amongst people when we raise the concept of reparations. And in thinking more deeply about it, and also reading actually about moral injury, we determined that that was the problem that we were experiencing as a country, as a whole, because one of the things that Bryan and I do is that we are focused on the mental health of the country, because there seems to be a belief that only African Americans and Brown people are the victims of this legacy. We are saying that the entire country is suffering from it, that you cannot perpetrate or be implicated in the perpetration of a crime against humanity and be unaffected. It affects everyone. And so we borrowed that term from Jonathan Shea, who really talked about it in terms of Vietnam vets. And what we mean by moral injury is like when you participate, you perpetrate, or you witness, or you fail to prevent an act that violates your moral beliefs of right and wrong. And in order to really address that, or I should say, when one addresses that, it activates feelings of shame and guilt. And as a reaction to that shame and guilt, people who are unwilling to tolerate that discomfort tend to double down in reaction to it. And it is our belief that that's been going on for the last 150 years, which is why it is so incredibly difficult to address the issue of reparations, because people get very defensive around that. We believe that defensiveness is about moral injury, because with moral injury comes feelings of shame and guilt. And we also feel that that is what accounts for the kind of backlash that we have seen over and over again when there is ever any movement towards Black equality. There has been a backlash to that to try to push us back. We are witnessing it right now with the Voting Rights Acts and all of the kind of craziness that we are witnessing right now in our government. And our premise is that it's not as if not addressing this makes it go away. It doesn't. That in the absence of the kind of atonement, recognizing the moral injury, doing what needs to be done to repair that in a communal sense. And we really look at this in terms of large group, governmental. It's got to be a communal thing. It doesn't have to be 100%, but it's got to be sanctioned by the body that made laws that made it possible. So in the absence of that, one is haunted. And we do believe that our country is haunted by the ghosts of the legacy of slavery, because, and will continue to be haunted until we do something about this crime against humanity and its legacies. And for us, that something is reparations.
Thanks so much to you both, Dr. Nichols and Connolly, for that psychological perspective as well. Last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Dave Ragland, who is a part of the Grassroots Reparations campaign. I think it's Ferguson, Missouri. Correct me if I'm wrong, but please, the floor is now yield to you. What are your thoughts around grassroots movements and reparations?
Good evening. I won't be able to turn on my camera, and I hope you all can hear me. Please give me a thumbs up if you can.
We got you.
Okay. Just a pleasure to be here and see all of the faces and hear just really important framework of reparations. And I wanted to just name that the approach and the way that we're looking at reparations at the Grassroots Reparations campaign is as a spiritual movement that influences and is part of various vectors of our life, political and social. And this spiritual movement around reparations is about repair and abolition. And it's a movement that emerges from my work and others' work in Ferguson, Missouri, and the abolition work around the country, but also the abolition work of actually ending the institution of slavery that those like Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells and so many others were engaged in. And those roots are in spirituality. And the work of reparations is not just about the money, the compensation, but it is about the ending of the institutions that emerged and keep us captive in every form of our life and keep our nation from moving forward, because its roots are doused in the blood of the world-making events of colonization and slavery. And I just want to share that that's sort of our general approach, but the work for me began in Ferguson after Mike Brown was killed. And before Ferguson, I was studying and teaching in peace and conflict studies. And the work in Ferguson for us was rooted in the notion of truth and reconciliation, as we learned from South Africa and as we studied with some of the folk at the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And we developed and helped to co-create a truth process around people who have been victimized by police violence, because we saw that truth-telling could be a moral intervention and public pedagogy around what is happening. And we know that when the truth is told, that so much is revealed, and often people are horrified. And we had a number of hearings in Ferguson, and it was that work that around truth-telling, and my friend Jody Geddes of Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth says this often: there cannot be truth-telling without reparations in the conversation, especially because truth-telling is the bearing of one's soul, and the bearing of one's soul of some of the most horrific events. And so we telling as sacred necessarily had to be sacred as well. Our campaign 19 and we began organizing in 2017 for Reparations Sunday and understanding of reparations as a spiritual practice. We saw reparations as a spiritual practice connected to the process of truth-telling. The United Nations along with this decade for the people of African descent, and in response to the conference in South Africa on racism, it emerged this understanding that slavery and colonization were crimes against humanity, even though we have been truth-telling about that throughout those processes up until this present day. They came up with the framework, and this framework is also part of transitional justice efforts around the world, but looking at reparations as compensation, satisfaction, or education as well, memorial building, healing, which is looking at the spiritual aspect of how people's religion were stolen, but also the mental and physical trauma passed on from generations. And then restitution, what was stolen needed to be returned. And we see this happening in places like Bruce Beach, and calls for it in Tulsa and all around the country where Black people escaped from terrorism in the South. And then guarantees of non-repeat, which for me is a decolonial and a moral proposition for us not to continue the same practices that got us here. And as one of the earlier speakers were describing, what are we invested in? Are we invested in justice? Are we invested in the same banks and institutions that profited from slavery? Are our laws transformative, or are they just reforming systems that were created to essentially exterminate and control and occupy communities of color? And so I think on this upcoming Reparations Sunday, what I'm really interested in is that transformational notion of reparations that is about the healing, that is about the inner transformation, that is not just about saying I'm an anti-racist, but practicing anti-racism every day, as Reverend spoke about what's in the ledgers and how those ledgers continue today. And so imagine our nation as a spirituality being really agnostic and focused on money and greed, and that's the highest moral value. And so money has to be a part of it, especially because so much of our energy as a nation is spent on that. But reparations would mean that we're accountable. And so I'm really happy to be here and share my thoughts about reparations, particularly this upcoming Reparations Sabbath and Sunday. And today's a Sabbath for many. And how toward the end of the Civil War, in Savannah, where I'm actually headed to be with some of our partners, one of the largest groups of enslaved Black folk were freed. And that led to 40 Acres and the Mule. And as a result of that historic emancipation, activists like Pat Gunn created and helped to push Jubilee Freedom Day, which has been happening for a decade, more than a decade in Savannah. And this Reparations Sunday is about Jubilee. Jubilee meaning freedom. And what are the responsibilities that come when people are freed? And in every religious text, there is discussion about Jubilee as a process, as supporting those who have been hurt, out of responsibility, out of connection and common humanity, and out of inner healing. And so I'm so excited about reparations as a spiritual practice that can help throw off what Doctors Bryan and Medria talk about as America's shadow. And this is one of the ways that we now have to reckon with this deep divide and need for healing. So thank you for hearing me and putting up with my the way I come to you. But thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Ragland. We appreciate your comments. Now, there were so many comments made, but I think the breadth of them really, for me, makes something striking to me, right? We have psychologists talking about the psychology of guilt and shame versus the psychology and weight on African Americans about how we have to instill certain confidence. You heard the need for musicians. You heard the need for community-based approaches. We've heard the need for history to be faced as we go to the United Nations. And we also hear the need from those who are, quote unquote, allies, those who are for abolition or for reparations. And what I want to do is ask a couple of questions to kind of focus us a bit and try to tease out some of these components more. I first want to go to Mertz, right? Being at, of course, Virginia Union, music is a big part of all of our traditions here. If you can just say a little bit more about the spiritual sustenance that music provides and how is this being used today to keep morale high? And what do you think music has to do with reparations? Can you talk to us about that a bit?
Well, the short answer is there's not enough music in the movement today to keep morale high. And I think we need to continue to reinvigorate and reinfuse the artistic notion. Duke Ellington and Ella Fitzgerald taught us it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. And so we have to continue to try to put that type of energy in. Back in the earlier movement, in the civil rights movement, I think about Sister Mamie Brown Mason, who was the director of the choir down in Birmingham, who sang when a young preacher named Martin Luther King was coming into town, and people were getting thrown into jail by the dozens and dozens and dozens, filling up those jails. And Sister Mamie Brown, heading into those jails, sang, "I'm on my way to freedom land. I'm on my way to freedom land. I'm on my way to freedom land. I'm on my way, great God Almighty, I'm on my way." And on the shoulders of great singers like, and Fannie Lou Hamer sang as well throughout the movement, and so many singers have sung throughout the movement. I suppose that the music, as I said earlier, the music is a part of how we reassert our humanity, which is being attempted to be stripped from us. But the last piece, I just say very, very briefly, is a reminder to everyone, if this is the last thing I say tonight, my dear friends, keep the music alive within you and rely on and believe in the power of that to give us courage to continue to move on. Oh, courage, my soul, and let us carry on, for the night is dark and I am far from home. And yet, thanks be to God, the morning light appears and the storm is passing over. Hallelujah. And so keep that energy and that fire alive. We're going to need it in the fights ahead.
Thanks so much, Minister Mertz, for that. I want to do something else too, because keeping the morale, something you said so powerful that I want to make sure we don't miss. You said music is a form of expression, a way that we maintain and signify our humanity. That was so powerful, man. Thank you for saying that. I want to do something else before we think more about some of the moral consequences and how that plays on our psyche. I'm so interested in hearing more, Reverend Lindsey Franklin, about what made you embark and research enslavers in your family, one, and then two, how as a minister this relates to your faith journey and sense of vocation.
Yeah, I think that a lot of, and this is changing, but I think that a lot of conversation about race in white churches is still kind of rooted in this idea of, our call as Christian is to love our neighbors as ourselves and to love God with our hearts. And I think a lot of it is still rooted too much, I would say, in the love your neighbor part of it. And I think that, there's almost this like call of to love our neighbor means to love, in white churches is like the racialized other, right? And I think that where my faith calls me to look at reparations is to look at myself and to recognize that I can't love my neighbor if I don't love myself, and I can't love myself if I can't see myself fully. And I think so much of white, and I can only speak for myself, but so much of my upbringing was like hiding, like not being able to see that history fully. Like they're so blinded by so many of the stories that were told, and not wanting to see that history. And so I think that my call towards looking at the history and then towards reparations is in that, like this sense of we're stuck if we don't look and try to process. And I think the only way we process is through reparations and moving forward. I don't know if that answered your question totally. But.
No, that's good. I certainly heard it for you. I mean, this deeply commitment to look at your family's history and past is deeply connected to your faith journey. And so I really appreciate you sharing that. I want to go back to Dr. Connolly for a bit to tell us more about, I was really struck by the way you talked about guilt and shame on one side, but I want us to raise a bit about what's the other feelings and sentiments on the other side for those historically oppressed. Talk about the psychology of reparations and what it not only means, but also the psychology of the Black psyche in history and what you find on the other side as you investigate us on that side, if you don't mind. Hope I'm not put you on the spot, but I want to hear about how Black folks feel and not just the white folks on the other side.
Well, and I'm going to bring Bryan in because, you know, we do have a dialogue here around this. I mean, Black people have certainly struggled with a sense of inferiority, not measuring up, struggling with issues of depression, anxiety, and collectively not feeling like we're enough, we're good enough, we're smart enough, we're competitive enough, and that what we imagine for, you know, that reparation really allows Black people to come to the table as full partners, to first of all have a seat at the table, that it reaffirms a sense of being full partners, reaffirms a sense of humanity, which we've always experienced. I mean, I don't think Black people have felt less than human. We've been treated that way, but that's not been our lived experience. But it's been a struggle and a climb and our sense of worthiness. We do believe that reparations will absolutely allow people to feel like they're full partners in our so-called democracy. And I don't know, Bryan, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, let me say, you know, as I said before, I came to this after many years working in community settings, particularly with gang prevention and gang intervention. And I thought about a lot of our kids in that world. And one of the papers we wrote, I referred to it as our kids having to make a Sophie's choice between choosing to work through a system in which they're going to feel lots of self-doubt, anxiety, worry about whether they can be all right, whether they can make it, or eschew that system altogether, say forget it, but then just live in a very risky life in the margins of society. I think reparations helps heal that split. It doesn't require us to make that kind of decision. It gives us a sense of real choice and real possibilities in life. I think that's what reparations does. I think for many of us, many of our kids who do choose the route of self-confidence, self-expression, the price of that is marginalization. And I don't want that to have to be that price.
Thanks so much. I also recognize that these conversations, right, these are international, national, and local conversations as well. But I want to start from the broad perspective and then kind of narrow in on what's happening in Richmond. To start with the broad perspective, I want to first ask Dr. Carruthers, can you talk about when you present to the United Nations or anybody, how do you answer this question? Why is reparations required for African Americans in country? How would you broadly answer that question?
Well, I would broadly answer it based on what we've heard. One, that you can't build on crimes against humanity. You can't build yourself and brand yourself as the democracy that everyone ought to follow if within your own geo-national boundaries, you really represent the complicity of the most probably protracted, historic, horrific violation of human rights that a people have ever experienced in the form of people of African descent and Native persons in the United States. And that gets increasingly a position that one finds oneself as a representative of the United States, in which you are in juxtaposition of living a lie, of being a lie, of going around the world articulating that you represent democracy, but fake news allows you to recreate revisionist history. And so what we say is that for two reasons, African Americans have vested interest in doing everything it can to impact United States foreign policy in relationship to how the rest of the world is organized. The world right now is organized around notions of white hegemony and white domination, not white supremacy, white domination, that is based on a myth of white supremacy that has resulted in a creation of a hierarchy of human value that says some people are more worthy than others. But as the world has gotten smaller, if we don't understand that COVID in Africa is going to impact COVID in the United States, just for example, real time right now, then we are losing sight of what the future holds for us. And so one of the ways in which I think we need to help the world understand is that Martin Luther King told us we are inextricably bound to each other in terms of interest, in terms of outcomes, in terms of future. And so at the global level, we have to say that African Americans must be the barometer of being in the belly of the beast, who go around the world representing a contradiction of a voice for democracy and represent a system which perpetuates and controls this hierarchy of human value in a way like none other. And so we're at a moment of racial reckoning in this country. And it's not about reform, and it's not about restoring, because you can't restore back to which never was. And so the issue is, how do we reconstitute the United States? And it's going to boil down to some fundamental things that Delegate McQuinn is going to have to address for us and help us with around just basic constitutional issues. Such as the college, how do you count votes and whose interests? The people who got reparations after slavery were the white former slave masters who lost property, quote unquote, because we were considered property.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carruthers, for that. And you also mentioned you pointed to, and I want to go to that next. So how does this struggle really work in the political realm on a local level? I'll be honest with you, I relocated you all from Texas about 2 years ago. Now I was shocked to hear that conversations about reparations and slavery was happening in the state of Virginia at the political level. And so Delegate McQuinn, if you don't mind, talk a bit about what's going on around reparations in the state of Virginia, what's happening around, and do you feel enough is happening about it? I know that you've been intimately involved in that. Tell us about your conversations in the state and politics and what's going on.
First of all, Dr. Tinsley, no, it's not enough going on. There are things that are happening that certainly many of us should feel very proud of in the former capital of the Confederacy? Absolutely. But all it takes is a stroke of a pen for those things that we have been pushing forward for it to be repealed. And those are things that certainly I'm looking at very closely. But I've had the honor of over the years helping to move forward an agenda that would reference reparations and healing and reconciliation and truth-telling through legislation that I have certainly, along with others, have fought to make sure that we make progress in implementing it, and first of all, patronage and implementation of that legislation, as we to look at the issue of slave enslavement, to look at what has happened in terms of and how Virginia played a major role in the transatlantic slave trade, to a place that got us where we are even today, dealing with the challenges of racism and the perpetuation of these systemic issues that continue to be walls and barriers that have been set up. And there in particular, there was a piece of legislation that looked at the study of slavery and the present day impact on generations of African Americans. And we are moving forward with that. But again, it has taken some time to get to this place. We're talking about, when you talk about reparations, as I've often said, I'm not asking anyone to put $2,000 in my bank account, because I may not have the knowledge and understanding of what did I do with that $2,000 to make an additional, to invest it and make, and to gain another $2,000. So therefore, there are other ways to help address that. And this legislation will begin to look at the issues of housing, the criminal justice system. It will look at the educational system, the universities and whatnot. How can we make sure that there are ways that this population, this group of people who have been left behind, who have not been a part of the equation, how do we, and I don't even want to say catch up, because I know the difficulty of us trying to become a part of a level playing field. It's going to be difficult because there have been so many systems that have been in place over the years. But however, let's look at ways that we can begin again to address the issue of restorative justice. How can we begin to help move people forward? How do we create generational wealth? And so this particular legislation, again, will look at a multiplicity of things, and the state government is playing a major role in this. We also had the our Governor Northam, as I mentioned earlier, who's leaving. He's going off the scene, but however, he was able to, through the executive order, begin to look at all of the departments and to see how at those various departments, what is occurring there, and how do we, the issue of equity and equality is addressed in those various departments. Again, as we look at the walls and the barriers, I think that we have a unique opportunity to help move this agenda forward. However, it will not just take the legislators. They're going to take everyday people to stand up and say, we demand this. This must happen. And we want a report to come back to the various community. The last thing I want to say about, the reparations in form of a museum being erected in the Shockoe Bottom area. I just think that if we move that forward, that is a form of telling the truth, identifying what has happened. Again, the role that Richmond played, the Commonwealth and this country, and internationally for that matter, have played a role in this transatlantic slave trade. This will give us an opportunity to honor those who have gone on, those of the past, but also leave a legacy for future generations. It should not be as difficult for my grandkids to find out about who they are and the origin of their existence as it has been for me. And so those forms of reparations, no, they are not necessarily in dollars and cents to individuals, but they do come in dollars and cents to help teach, educate, the entire society about what has happened, and not just about Black Americans' history, but about America's history. And I think those are forms that we can begin, again, telling the truth and moving an agenda forward in terms of reparations for folks who, again, been disenfranchised, marginalized, and just in many ways left behind.
Thank you, Delegate, well as the rest of you for such powerful comments for all of us. I do want to give some time for our audience to give some questions near the end, but I have two more that I'm gonna open up to all of you. Anyone who wants to take it is fine. And I want to ask about Delegate McQuinn talked about some efforts going on here in Richmond, and we've seen other piecemeal local scale movements like in Evanston, Illinois. I want to open up to everybody to answer in your own way. What do you think are some of the ways we can bridge local and national movements for reparations, and what other major obstacles you see are in the way of pursuing a more comprehensive agenda for reparations nationwide? Anybody can take that.
This is Dave. I want to just take it maybe because I have to jump off, but this has been, I'm learning so much, and it's just such a pleasure to see Dr. Carruthers again, and Benjamin Mertz, and so many other friends. And I wanted to say that, you know, the local, one of the things that Willard Lett, who was the education co-chair for NCOBRA, has said is that, you know, some of the local pieces are not full reparations as they've described using that 5-area framework, but they are reparative. And I think we have to be reparative until we get to full reparations, and that the local builds the framework and the support and the knowledge in communities so that the national is possible. And, you know, some of the obstacles or some of the other pieces are that there are over 40 different truth processes emerging around the country, and many of them have reparations in them. And so I think that one of the strategies that we have to look at is supporting local truth-telling processes and encouraging these local municipalities and governments and institutions and groups to think about reparations as part of their truth-telling. And that builds, I think, a culture of reparations. Because how do we fight against the backlash that will come with the federal bill if not enough people know and have a stake in and believe that and know that they're benefiting from the interest of injustice? Mm-hmm. Because the theft of land, the enslavement of people, it didn't just benefit the government did that for families, for churches, for schools, for seminaries, for banks. And so everyone has a stake in repair. And that doesn't mean everybody have to cut a check, but it means that we have to understand it, and we have to advocate for it happening in ways that are reflective of what people want. And nobody gets to say, you don't know what to do with your money. Reparations is repayment for a moral and material harm. There are no qualifications. Because you're a descendant of people who experienced it, you are accountable. And so I think that the local is definitely connected to the national. And one of the obstacles that I've seen is, you know, we have a Democratic Black man whip who's not whipping and who's an obstacle to progressive legislation. And we have a president who has not stood up and did what he said he was going to do. And you have a Speaker of the House similarly who is not. And so I think we really have to look to the local, because 2 years, less than a year, we're going to have potentially a conservative Congress, and who knows what we'll get in 4 years or when the election comes. Not that Biden was anybody's answer for anything. I mean, especially when Susan Rice is in charge of Biden's domestic agenda. And I think that this administration and the white liberal establishment continue to really sidestep and allow and listen to Black folk pushing respectability politics or divisive conservative influences on people who really don't, who are pushing like, reparations is just this one thing, right? And it's got to be, this is money. And reparations is about really making sure that we're abolishing these systems while we are helping people to move up in their capabilities so they can do and be what they choose to. So thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Ragland, for that. Anybody else want to talk about what they see as obstacles and how we can bridge local and national movement for reparations before I move to one last question, then we'll take a question from the audience. Anybody else want to comment on that? Great. So I see we can really talk all night. We only have 15 minutes left, but I do want to pause and allow members in our audience who are so attuned to the conversation to ask any questions they might wish. The only thing we ask is that you make sure it's a question and don't go down the runway too long for it. Make sure it's a question so we can be respectful and try to get as many as we can. I see Michael with his hands raised. I will acknowledge him and ask Michael to go ahead with his.
Yes, thank you so much for that presentation. It's very informative, very inspiring. The question I have is for the delegate, McQuinn, for the delegate and the psychologist, saying that money can never cure a problem after 400 years of, white supremacy, lynching, brutality, and slavery. And the question I have is that, why is that when Congress issued cash reparations to Jews, Native Americans, Japanese, the federal government didn't tell them what to do with their money. They gave them money and said, hey, it's up to you guys to invest it, to create communities. Like, for example, in California, the Japanese were issued cash reparations when they came to California as intermittent refugees, and they got cash payment. And the federal government and Congress did not control the Japanese what to do with their money. So I understand why we're making issue for cash reparations so difficult for African Americans to attain, because they found this country for 400 years. Now they found this country for 400 years. They built it involuntarily.
So if I hear you correctly, Mike, you're asking why not money? Why is it so hard for African Americans when it's happened in the past? Delegate McQuinn or anyone else who wants to take that?
Yeah, I would speak to it because I want to make sure that I'm clear that there is no opposition that I have toward money or money as a way of reparation. But there are so many other ways that I do feel strongly that if it's not necessarily in hard dollars, that may be a part of it. But however, the redlining of houses, when you've got communities that are living in these poverty-stricken areas and have been there for generations, 5 generations in some cases, how do we help move them out of those various places? When you look at the educational system and more in poverty-stricken areas where, in the West End, they have the best of everything as it relates to education, even in higher ed. And then in many of these communities, you have schools that are still begging for resources to educate our children. When you talk about, other areas that I have seen, and it's been painful to see, where I know resources should have been going in that direction to help families and communities move forward, and it has not occurred. So when I talk about, you don't have to just give me $2,000 and dollars and cents, there may be other ways. I want to make sure that maybe they need to to educate every African-American child that was born between a certain period of time. Now, it is not giving them $1 in their hand, but they're still paying for these young people to be educated, since education was taken off of the table as something for us. So that's what I'm hoping I'm explaining to you in terms of my just using that analogy, that you don't have to put dollars in my hand. But there are so many other ways I think that we could be compensated, or this reparation issue could be addressed. And that's what I'm talking about as well.
Right, and also have a black agenda for that.
Hold one second. Hold on a second.
Education.
Wait, hold one second. Hold one
like
second. If you don't mind, let me please acknowledge the names before you speak. Otherwise, we won't be able to go forward. Thank you for that, Michael. I want to now acknowledge the next hand I saw, which was Daniel. Daniel, you have a question. Then I'll go to Mark Westfall.
Good evening, and thank you so much, Dr. Tinsley. I am Daniel Thomas from Virginia Union University, I'm the Center of African American History and Culture. And my question is, as an undergraduate student at Virginia Union University, what can I do with my platform with being with a liaison for this culture or this information of generation that is well informed? How can I take this knowledge and transfer it to Virginia Union University's campus and even spread it to Virginia Commonwealth University? What can I do, or what do anyone on the panel suggest that I can use my platform in getting the younger generation involved in this movement, in acknowledging and making sure that we are all informed as a community and a culture about what is entitled to us?
Thanks, Daniel. Anyone want to help toward how do young activists and students now get involved in this struggle? Any advice for them?
Well, I actually thought our moderator was going to take that, but I'll begin by suggesting one very practical way to get the student attention from peer to peer is to start looking at student debt and deconstructing student debt in terms of the relationship between the wealth gap and how systems of commodification and the creation of debt is a part of this conversation. And therefore, the reversal of debt relief, whether you're talking about the cancellation of debt from nation states. I mean, to think that Haiti just paid France off a few years ago for the debt in relationship to slavery. How could the Haitian people owe European governments as a result of liberating themselves, right? All centuries. Okay, so from that level, in terms of deconstructing it for students to do the analysis down to their own personal pocketbooks. What happens when people use your money in order to gain money for themselves? What happens with Facebook taking donations from you and then giving it out as a way for them to expense it on their balance books and take full advantage of you? So therefore, I think we have to find creative ways to meet people where they are at the local level that we've talked about. And in terms of students, absolutely, student debt is the way to begin that conversation.
I'd only add to what Dr. Ragland powerfully said as well. Part of what you're doing tonight, right? Student engagement and how does reparations relate to racial justice struggles in modern times? Inviting other students to participate not only in the conversation, but the grassroots movements that one of our other panelists talked about. So the first thing is student engagement, informing oneself and becoming conversant with the topic about what is reparations. And these are things we're going to try to do at Virginia Union as well. This is not the first. In February, we'll talk about reparations, reconciliation, and racial justice. And so getting students involved in the conversation and speaking with our people who are on the front lines like these here are going to be one of the first important steps as well. We have time for about one more question. I'm going to go to Mr. Mark Westfall now with his question. Go ahead, Mark.
Hello, thank you very much for taking my question and for the esteemed panel. I am learning so much and very much appreciate everyone's time. My question is about reparations. I understand that Germany was forced to make some reparations after World War II towards the Jewish peoples. I have not studied it in depth, but I heard there was an exchange of politicians and other things. Anyways, I was wondering if the panelists, anybody has opinion on that, and if it has any application for the United States. Thank you.
So if I can try to restate out what I'm hearing is, does the I guess, execution of reparations toward one group in Germany or other, does it have implications for how African Americans or how we think about reparations, right? And what should come to us?
Well, I think that as well. And also, there's going to be a lot of people dragging their feet on this. I mean, I'm all for reparations. And perhaps it was forced in Germany initially, but I understand it's become part of their social conscience and that they willingly paid money. But that's, I haven't looked at it in depth. I don't know if really it was true reparations or if it was a token.
No, what I will ask, and maybe anybody, I know, Dr. Nichols, if you,
Yes.
Go ahead.
Marjorie and I have looked at this question quite a bit, and there's a book that details that process of how Germany came to provide reparations, Learning from the Germans by Susan Neiman. But one of the effects is you don't see statues of Nazis in Berlin. That's one of the effects of them providing reparations to Israel. They paid not only Israel, but individual Jewish citizens. You see a very serious effort on their part to make amends, even though it may have been forced. And Susan Neiman describes this process that it was pushed for 10 or 20 years before any movement really happened. Initially, the Germans said, "We are the victims of the aggression of the Western Alliance. They bombed our cities. They firebombed us. We are the victims." And so it almost required another generation of Germans to be born who felt ashamed of that Nazi heritage to begin to change the tide and accept that reparations. Of course, there was a huge incentive for the Germans to eventually accept it so they could be welcomed back into the world community. But eventually it trickled into the sort of emotional atmosphere of the country. You walk through Berlin and you'll see plaques of Jews and where they were taken at different points. So you see the memorialization of that atrocity in a way that you see it only in bits and pieces here in the United States.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Nichols. I'm going to take one more question, and then we're going to ask Mertz to come back and close us out in preparation for his music workshop and also what we have going on here. But there's a question that was in the chat that I want to make sure I acknowledge from Ms. Ann Gilmore. And given the connectivity that all of us agree that this is a moral, spiritual, psychological issue, what do you see the role of faith communities in the work of repair and reparations? Whoever wants to take this, what role do we see faith communities in this work of reparations?
Well, I certainly see faith communities as leading by example, starting with interrogating at their own level of parish house to denominational structures, to the ways in which they have had both historical and contemporaneous complicity in the perpetuation of the systems for which the consequences we are still grappling with. When the faith community is silent, silence makes a mighty noise. And the way in which silence now, even around January 6th, is speaking with great, great fervor. The way in which the silence around January 6th is being mitigated by the falsification and the spreading of lies so that the lies become the truth and the truth becomes the lies. Where is the church's voice to be the moral authority, to be the moral barometer that will say, this is not right, and we will stand on the right side of justice? So the faith community has a great role to play because it really represents the voice of that which is right and the voice of God.
My. Awesome. Friends, we really are short on time, but as I said in the beginning, this is the beginning of a conversation in partnership. Certainly not the last thing. Richmond Hill and VUU, Samuel DeWitt, Proctor, and all these institutions and organizations are going to be continuing this conversation going on. We just wanted to whet your appetite. This is a pre-event for what Reparations Weekend here in Richmond would be. I'm going to ask Pam to come back, if she doesn't mind, to tell us a bit more about tomorrow. And then on Sunday at VUU, which will be joining us here for concert, celebration, also commentary, if she doesn't mind. And then Mr. Mertz will close us all out in song for tonight. Ms. Smith, if you come.
It's like we got to get ourselves out of here. So leave yourself muted, because if you've ever tried to sing all together unmuted before on Zoom, you've already understood that it is a catastrophe when it happens. So please leave yourself muted, but I encourage you, while muted, to sing along with me. The piece says, "Guide my feet while I run this race, for I don't want to run this race in vain." And it sounds like this. Guide my feet while I run this race. I said, guide my feet while I run this race. Said, guide my feet now while I run this race. For I don't want to run this race in vain. Help me out, say, hold my hand. Oh, hold my hand. While I run this race, please just hold my hand. Oh, while I run this race, I'm talking about hold my hand. While I run this race, for I don't want to run this race in vain. One more verse, I need your help. I need your help. Let me tell you, while I run this race, oh, I need your help. While I run this race, can't do it alone. I need your help, my friends. While I run this race, for I don't want to run this race in vain. No, 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 I said I don't want to run this race in vain.